So SD Bank has no opinions about fiscal policies except when it's perceived to interact with, influence the areas which the bank operates in, and that would be something about stability, monetary stability, price stability, or something like that. But by and large, central bankers should shut up when fiscal policies are discussed. So in some sense, I should go home now, but let me just continue. So we have got a story about Latvia, and I think the sort of story was that we should compare. Maybe Latvia and Estonia. I will actually almost prefer Lithuania because this is in some sense a more interesting case, but let's come back to that later on. When I left my parents' home when I was 18, my father was not very interested, and I sort of eventually sort of grabbed him, and then I said, don't you have some piece of advice to me before I'm going out there in life on my own? And then he was sort of thinking, and then he came up with this one: be lucky. And this is a fantastic piece of advice, and if you are lucky, things are usually going well for you. If you're unlucky, you're typically unlucky. I subscribe to the view that we should try to analyze the causes of the crisis and take measures taking that into account. And I would then use the opportunity to advertise the most recent working paper from SD Bank, the most recent working paper from SD Bank, where I and a colleague have been looking at which countries in Europe could we explain why some countries in Europe were very badly hit by the crisis and why some were cruising like nothing really had happened. I would say, however, we should not be too optimistic about sort of undigging the underlying reasons. This is perhaps where we would disagree a little bit. One of the most interesting and active literatures in economics is the literature on what happened during the Great Depression in the 30s in the US. So here, thousands of economists have spent the last 80 years trying to find out what were the causes of the global depression. And I can tell you that they are light years from having any sensible answer to that question. So if we sort of are waiting for fiscal policies or other policies, if we're waiting for the Latvian economists to produce some really solid evidence regarding the causes of the crisis, we may be in for a long wait, and the map of Europe might look very different. So let me tender my suggestion. Why did Latvia get so relatively hard hit by the crisis, and why did at least the fiscal, sort of headline fiscal balances here in Estonia look so much better? And now I will come back to my father, luck. And this is a good idea that the Estonians are lucky and the Latvians are unlucky. I mean, what's wrong with that, right? And it's not very difficult to explain this case of luck. Parix Bank was a domestically owned bank, which we can sort of discuss about whether there was something about the privatization process. It was sort of stolen by a couple of guys. It was former trade, the Republican state trading banks, which were created during the Gorbachev era, which were then captured by some smart guys. But at the end of the day, they had a big privately owned bank. And Estonia, a few years ago, had a big privately owned bank. It just happened that some guys from Swedbank came to Tallinn and said, let's just buy the whole stuff. And if they had not bought it, and there are many in Estonia who say it was a disaster, I can mention, I will not mention anybody here, but there were many who were crying. They are stealing the crown of the Estonian economy. If they had not bought Swedbank, if SEB had not bought Ühisbank, then Estonia would have collapsed big scale and in a way which make the Latvian experience look like a picnic. So we were lucky here. But again, this is my father's advice, be lucky. I think we will come back to the sort of fiscal policy issues. Let me just sort of, we're discussing models. So I was actually in Bologna to discuss models. Yeah, it sort of turned into more into lunches and dinners and so on. But okay, I don't know. Would we not be surprised if the transition countries nailed it? I would agree that you can see lots of, sort of look along the path, you can find lots of mistakes here and there. Sort of maybe a little bit depending on your political viewpoint or whether you have read Keynes and Friedman or whatever you have read. Of course, there were many mistakes done. But we would also be very surprised if any country in the world could cruise through on the right policies at the right time, giving the obscenely fantastic results. Of course, we wouldn't have that. The exercise I use to sort of calm myself down is take the whatever graph you have for the Baltics or for Central and Eastern Europe. You can take whatever you sort of want. Kilometers of highways, unemployment, GDP growth, whatever. And then take the corresponding graphs for Portugal and Spain after they became democracies. Then put them over each other, and you cannot see any difference. So this means that you can go to Spain now and present your diagnosis there too, because it's most likely they must have done something wrong too. So evidently there were policy mistakes made in, I guess, almost whatever political and economic background you have. But we should not sort of have raised the expectations so high that our whole life becomes misery. The Baltic heads of states had a meeting in Tallinn 2 weeks ago. So from Latvia, from Lithuania, and what I was most shocked about was hearing so I was in Lithuania at that time, but I read the press reviews or press stories. The Lithuanian Prime Minister said he had become smarter. He had become a little bit sort of informed about economics, because he was active as a young person in economic policy, or sort of in politics, economic policy in 1990-91. And he said that he expected that by 1994, the Lithuanian economy would look like the Swedish. Then you're also sort of raising the bar quite high. And of course, then it is a pure disaster what has happened in this part of the world. But I think we should be careful not to be too ambitious. Let me just finally sort of, we'll come back to the fiscal policies, I think. But the crisis, of course, hit us by surprise. But we have now sort of solid evidence that at least from Roman times, persons have been surprised by financial crisis. And if you are not surprised, then you are a very, very, very rich man, because then you can take positions against the market. So then you can, so of course we got surprised. And it was a bit embarrassing. I mean, of course, I would also talk about these things in the run-up, also in the administration. The story, so what happened was that there were enormous capital inflows. In some sense, what you could argue is that this is foreign international investors who have put their own money into the game. They were betting that Latvia or Estonia were really fantastic bets. We may be concerned that they overdid it. Some of the investments are clearly not productive now, but this is also sort of, because now the economy is down, and then of course nobody wants to rent a 400 square meters apartment in the center of Tallinn anymore. It's not crazily easy what to do with these capital flows. One could sort of try different sort of measures. The key word in sort of IMF EU is prudential regulation. And this is probably a very good thing. I don't know what it is, but I think it's fantastic. The question is whether one would like to put more things into place. So Israel, the governor of Israel, Bank of Israel, is Stan Fischer, who spent most of his career, which actually he was a professor at MIT, he ended up at IMF, and he spent most of his career arguing against capital controls. And last year he imposed capital controls in Israel to stem capital inflows. One can consider whether one could, one cannot do it as long as one is a member of the internal market. That's not possible. There is a free market for goods and capital and workers, except if you're from Bulgaria and Romania. So this is an issue we can discuss. It sort of will be difficult to implement. One can discuss whether one could come up with some kind of substitutes. I hope we can take that discussion afterwards. The EU is currently riding a different horse. There are a few people in the Commission and also among heads of states of European countries who are sort of a little bit in shock these days. And the EU version is that the current account deficits, which is a corresponding thing to capital inflows. The current account deficits is a result of a lack of competitiveness. This could be like wages being too high, being in the wrong sectors, or something like that. So this is a horse the EU will be riding for the next many years. So this pact for, what is it called, pact for the competitiveness, now it's a pact of the euro. It's all fine with me. My suspicion is that this is a relatively slow-moving horse to get on. I don't expect very much from that. The issue about sort of footloose capital, as we sometimes call it, is sort of, this is perhaps more of an issue which is controversial, but where sort of good ideas are warranted. That would be it.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pass on the floor to Professor.
Yeah, okay, I can. Well, first I would probably give a few comments on both previous talks. I would, first of all, I would really agree that the difference between the Estonian and other politics is in many cases luck, and I would add to the banking sector luck we had, also the geographic luck of being very close to Finland and Sweden, and also the lack of importing their business culture, especially in late 90s, but early 2000s as well. So a lot of privatization and a lot of foreign direct investors that came to Estonia have a Finnish or Swedish background. So this sort of gave a quite distinctly different business culture, I assume, as in Latvia, where we really cannot speak in Estonia about oligarchs or things like that. So you don't really have this kind of, or well, let's say even if you can, they are more hidden. And in Estonia, of course, we have a let's say, a rhetorical or political device which really doesn't maybe allow us to speak about oligarchs. And this is, of course, the existence of Edgar Savisaar, who always is, even if you don't like right-wing parties, you dislike even more the Edgar Savisaar or his possibility to become to power. So always, even if you think that right-wing parties are doing something wrong, or even if they have too much economic interest, or if they packed some economic interest too much, you can always argue that we are much better than he would be. So I think this is also something that's probably lacking in Latvia.